National Institute of Disability Rehabilitation and Research. The contents of the forum do not necessarily represent the policies of education or any other federal agency. The presenters are solely responsible for all views expressed. So if you have a problem with the views, blame these guys, basically. That's the short story. So let me just start with a few housekeeping items to begin with. The first is if you have a cell phone, turn it off. We will, at the end of the meeting, we will entertain questions from both our in-house and our webinar audiences following the presentation. This is our first forum at Mathematica's new DC office, and one of the things we'd like to know is what you think. And Allison in the back row will be collecting information from you. There are packets on your chairs, and you'll find a comment card. Please complete the card and either place it in one of the black boxes on the counters along the walls, or we'll have members from the Mathematica team collecting them as the forum concludes. So let's jump right into today's session. And I think it's a really exciting one, and I'm happy to see such a large audience here in person as well as on the web. Today's session outlines a strategy for moving forward with the 21st century disability policy. It tries to address a perplexing problem. Even though spending on programs to support people with disabilities have been expanding at rapid rates, the economic status of this population has lagged behind people without disabilities. A recent study revealed that 12% of federal spending goes to supporting this population, which translates to $357 billion in 2008. And yet 28% of people with disabilities, 19.8 million people, live in poverty. A question that we have for today's policy forum is whether we can do better with this investment. The papers today indicate that there are alternatives, but key challenges to implementation. The challenge today, there are in fact multiple proposals out there that identify modifications to the current system, such as those from David Autor, Richard Burkhauser, Mary Daly, as well as from the World Institute on Disability. These proposals look to different models, such as short-term disability, private disability insurance, and experience rating. The motivations for these proposals are based on experience from private and international programs. Although the details differ, the messages in the proposals are actually share one similarity. Namely, the current Social Security disability programs built on the assumption that disability and employment are mutual exclusive states is both archaic and fiscally unsustainable. A second similarity also exists for each of these proposals. Namely, there is a lack of evidence on policies that would be most effective in improving the lives of people with disabilities. Without such evidence, there's no way to build consensus on a promising strategy that will bring together all of the needed actors for change. These include policymakers, researchers, disability advocates, and most importantly, as Susan Daniels would all remind us, people with disabilities. In short, we need to know what works, and at present, unfortunately, we don't. So what is new about today's session, and what is different about the proposals talked today? Well, first of all, today's session looks at a proposal that once again attacks the assumption that disability and employment are mutually exclusive. So in that vein, there is some similarity with previous proposals. However, the new parts are, first, the proposal idea, but secondly, the pathway towards implementing the proposal idea. So Bonnie O'Day is going to start us off. And Bonnie is a senior researcher at Mathematica here who specializes in conducting research and employment studies on disability and employment. And she will describe the current policies to promote employment for working-age people with disabilities. Her presentation will put the challenges and failings inherent in the existing disability support system in context, which motivates the subsequent policy proposal, which will be discussed by our second presenter, David Mann, who's at the end of the table for people in the room, who is a researcher in Mathematica's Health Division and will describe an approach to developing disability policy by revamping the system of supports based on a new administrative structure at the federal, state, and local levels, that attempts to streamline services for people with disabilities. Among its unique features include a new disability support administrator, streamlined funding, and more active roles for people with disabilities in policy development. The third presenter is Dave Stapleton, the director for our Center for Studying Disability Policy. Dave has the hard job of describing how what are some of the obstacles to implementation and how to overcome these obstacles, and ultimately to a revised version of the 21st century policy that benefits both people with disabilities and the American economy. Finally, Kelly Buckland, who is the executive director of the National Council on Independent Living and has been actively involved in disability issues since 1979, including the passage of the Personal Assistance Services Act, will comment on the discussion. So in short, we have Bonnie. She'll describe the problem. David Mann will talk about one approach to fixing it. Dave Stapleton will then describe how to implement an evidence-based reform. And Kelly will conclude by telling us how they're doing. So before starting, I wanted to leave the audience with two important questions to think about in the question and answer phase. First, the first question is, what do these presentations tell us about developing an effective policy? And second, and maybe more importantly, what would it take for these proposals or even other proposals to be implemented to facilitate change to the current system? So with those big picture questions, let me turn it over to Bonnie now, who will gleefully start by painting, as her title suggests, a discouraging picture.
Thank you. And I'm also here on this panel this morning because the people who were arranging this panel needed someone from Mathematica whose name was not Dave. This material that I'm going to talk about this morning is based on work conducted by the Center for Studying Disability Policy over the last few years. So in this presentation, I'll show why substantial policy reform is needed, that working age people with disabilities are much more likely than people without disabilities to live in poverty and to be outside the workforce. As a group, we with disabilities did not share in the economic prosperity of the late 1990s, and on the whole, things have gotten much worse during the most recent economic downturn. The conceptual definition of disability used for the major income support programs, which is, as David said, inability to work because of a long-lasting medical condition, has remained unchanged for half a century, even though it makes no sense because, of course, it does not reflect the role of the environment and other factors in determining whether a person is able to work. Recent piecemeal reforms have failed to address this situation and bring people with disabilities into the mainstream of society. And this remains true despite the ever-escalating costs of disability support programs that David mentioned. This discouraging situation will likely continue unless we can successfully implement broad systemic reforms to provide economic self-sufficiency and bring disability programs into line with more modern thinking about disability. And implementation of such reforms might be the only way to protect people with disabilities from benefit cuts that are likely to occur as the federal government addresses the funding shortfalls for entitlement programs, including SSI, SSDI, and medical programs like Medicare and Medicaid. The employment rate of working age people with disabilities is well below that of their non-disabled counterparts, as we all know, regardless of what national survey is used or how we measure disability. The statistics you see here are from the American Community Survey, which is an annual survey of the U.S. Census Bureau. Here you see 6 disability measures and their employment rates as compared to people without disabilities. So to summarize, in 2010, only about 33% of working age people with one of these disabilities were employed compared to about 73% of people with no disability. That's an employment gap of 40 percentage points. And even more startling, only 20% of people with disabilities work full-time year-round. Employment rates really vary by type of disability, from a low of about 16% for people with independent living and self-care disabilities to a high of about 50% for people with hearing disabilities. The next slide shows the relative employment rate and household income of people with work limitations from 1980 to 2008. The top line shows the mean household income, and the bottom line shows the employment rate of people with work limitations relative to the corresponding value for those without such limitations. You can see here the relative employment rate has declined over time, and that relative household income has declined right along with employment. No surprise there. If the relative employment rate in 2009 had been the same as in 1981, the number of people with disabilities employed would have been 1.2 million higher than it is now, largely because of the increase in people with disabilities who leave the workforce. The household income of workers with disabilities has not kept pace with their non-disabled counterparts. The low employment rates of people with disabilities are also reflected in high poverty rates for the population. Poverty rates for people with at least one disability are over twice as high as for those with no disability. That's 28% versus just under 12%. Many others live in families with households that are just above the federal poverty standard. Almost two-thirds of those in poverty for 36 months, in other words, the long-term poor, have a disability, and about 50% of those on SSI or DI live in poverty. And of course, these rates reflect the official poverty standard, a standard that doesn't even consider the extraordinary disability-related expenses that many of us incur. Poverty rates are high despite the fact that almost 9 million working-age adults with disabilities receive income support from SSI and SSDI programs. The top line in this chart shows the number of SSDI worker beneficiaries under age 65 between 1970 and 2010. The SSDI caseload has nearly tripled in size since 1980, from 2.8 million to nearly 8 million in 2010. That's a 175% increase. The bottom line shows the projected growth in SSDI beneficiaries if the age-sex-specific rates of participation for covered workers had remained the same since 1980. The growth shown by this line is the result of population growth, the aging of the baby boom generation with a higher likelihood that older workers would apply for SSDI, and growth of the female labor participation, which increases the number of people who are eligible for SSDI. The projected number of beneficiaries in 2010 is 2.2 million lower than the actual number. That's a 28% difference. That difference represents growth in participation rates for covered workers within the age-sex group. The decline in the economic status of people with disabilities occurred despite ever-growing public expenditures that have outpaced economic growth. In fiscal year 2008, the federal government spent over $357 billion on programs to support individuals with disabilities, including income maintenance, health care, housing, food assistance, and then education, training, and employment programs. This represents 12% of federal outlays and 2.5% of GDP, and the states add on top of that about $71 billion. From FY 2004 to 2008, federal disability expenditures grew by about 30% after adjusting for inflation. And it's interesting to note here that the only expenditure category that dropped over this period after adjusting for inflation was the education, training, and employment category. Expenditures are growing faster than federal outlays in GDP because of the rapid growth in the number of people with disabilities receiving income and health care support, along with rapid growth in the cost of health care. Thus, the point here is that the economic fortunes of people with disabilities are declining despite the rapid growth in expenditures for public programs that are intended to improve their economic well-being. Despite this discouraging picture, the idea of people with disabilities living, working, and participating in their communities has become the expectation and the goal of many significant programs and policies in which, many of us help to get passed, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Ticket to Work Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and others. Some of these programs, like the Ticket Act, allow states to experiment with disability programs and policy changes and to provide a wider range of employment supports to people with disabilities. But unfortunately, so far, these programs have had little success in increasing the number of people with disabilities who are employed. Technological and other innovations have enabled people with very significant physical and mental conditions to work productively. The nature of work itself has also changed so that some physical and mental conditions are less of an impediment to work. It has also become feasible and in many cases required to modify the work environment to accommodate workers with significant physical or mental conditions. These factors make it much more feasible for today's disability recipients to work than their counterparts from 4 or 5 decades ago when the current disability programs were initiated. Also changing are the types of disabilities among non-elderly adults. Fewer workers are experiencing acute illnesses such as heart attacks and strokes before retirement. Instead, mental disorders, arthritis, back pain, and repetitive stress injuries are prevalent among younger workers. They are leaving the workforce and applying for SSI and DI. Yet, the criteria for SSI and SSDI eligibility has not changed since the early 1960s, 50 years ago. Basically, applicants are eligible for SSDI if they've made sufficient payroll tax contributions and can no longer engage in SGA, substantial gainful activity, for a medical determinable reason. That is, they can no longer work enough to earn more than a minimal amount per month. The basic concept of the program, which is early retirement insurance for medical reasons, remains unchanged. The reality is that medical advances, technical progress, and social change have created a world in which many people with disabilities are in an ever-broadening gray area between able to work and not able to work. In other words, a growing proportion of people with disabilities can work at some level, but need some type of assistance so they can attain or maintain a reasonable standard of living. Yet, the Social Security Act reflects the notion that there is a narrow, medically determinable line between those who can work above SGA and those who supposedly cannot. Economic self-sufficiency policies would take advantage of the productive capacities of people with disabilities while providing sufficient support to ensure that those who do work will achieve a higher standard of living than they're able to achieve under current policies. They would capitalize on the advances in technology, training, and medicine that we've achieved over the last 30 years and increase the efficiency and productivity of the system. So now, the tough part, I had the easy part. I'm going to turn it over to David Vann and then to David Stapleton to describe what a 21st century disability policy might look like.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. My presentation is going to outline a paper that Dave Stapleton and I wrote this past fall It outlines a 21st century disability policy for America. We present our proposal in 3 parts. And today I'm going to describe the programmatic and financial reforms we propose, and then Dave Stapleton is going to take over and talk about the policy transition. When Dave and I started writing the paper, we thought it was important to outline what the primary objectives were going to be of the reforms that we were proposing. And we came up with 2 primary reform objectives. The first reform objective is to create a fiscally sustainable policy. And for us, that meant a policy that slowed expenditure growth and overall promoted efficient allocation of resources. Well, we thought that the 21st century disability policy should do more than that. We also felt that it should fulfill the aspirations of people with disabilities. And for us, this meant a policy that supported work, promoted independence, and overall improved the well-being of this population. A population, as Bonnie has just shown, has seen its economic fortunes decline dramatically over the past several decades. The programmatic reforms have 4 primary objectives. The first objective is to expect and empower people to work if they have sufficient work capacity. With assistance, many individuals with impairments are capable of making contributions to their own support through work. And for those individuals, we want to recognize that potential and then give them the support they need to make those contributions. However, there are many individuals out there whose impairment has made it such that even with assistance, they are incapable of making contributions to their own support. And for those individuals, we want to protect and strengthen the supports they receive under current law. We want to provide program oversight. We want to make sure that applicants and beneficiaries, that their voices are heard and that their rights are protected. And last but not least, we want to consolidate support determinations and delivery. Currently, we have a patchwork of federal, state, and local programs that deliver services to this population. And this chart provides an overview of the system. This is a system that has service overlaps, service gaps. It has a lot of arrows. It's a mess, and something really needs to be done to consolidate these services. We propose consolidating these services under a single entity that we call the Disability Support Administrator, or DSAs. Now, the DSAs would be spread out throughout the country, and they would have state or sub-state jurisdictions, and they could be administered by a state or local government, a private organization, or even a coalition of multiple entities. The basic idea is this: whatever entity is best able to administer a DSA within a given area, that is the entity that does so. Eligibility determination and support delivery would be consolidated under these DSAs. And we believe that this has 2 primary advantages. The first advantage is that it gives us that efficient management of resources that we're looking for, but it also does more than that. It provides a single point of contact for beneficiaries. No longer would beneficiaries have to maneuver this patchwork of federal, state, and local programs. They could come to their local DSA, be evaluated, and then receive the benefits that they need in order to live productive lives. This is a view of the structured system. State and federal revenues are both going directly to the disability support administrators that provide a variety of services to this population. The federal government would provide limited but important oversight of the DSAs, and it would do this through several means. First, the federal government would establish a national benefit eligibility criteria. It would also adjudicate appeals. The federal government would retain its role adjudicating appeals. So when an applicant is denied benefits, they would appeal under a system that is administered by the federal government. The government would also monitor and report key outcomes and promote innovation that improves program outcomes. They would do this by encouraging DSAs to innovate, and when a DSA successfully innovates, the federal government would help disseminate that best practice throughout the system. The federal government would also create a national advisory board that would be filled with consumers that would monitor the system and provide important feedback. How DSAs would determine support eligibility. When an individual goes to a DSA and applies, they would be evaluated to determine their potential work capacity, and based on that and a number of other factors, they would either be approved or denied for benefits. Successful applicants would be assigned to one of the three following groups, which I will describe in more detail. Workers with disabilities, retirees with impairments, or people with low work capacity. And the scope of benefits that an individual would be eligible for would depend on which group they have been assigned to. The group whose scope of benefits departs most radically from what is available under current law is the workers with disabilities group. This is the group that I was talking about earlier. These include those with significant impairments, but potential work capacity. And these individuals would receive a tailored package of benefits that could include some, one, or all of the following: a disability allowance, self-sufficiency counseling services, under an in-cap tax credit, or disability or employment services. Some individuals in this group could have benefits that are time-limited or conditional. For instance, some beneficiaries might need to demonstrate a good faith job search effort in order to continue receiving benefits. Now on to the other groups. Retirees with impairments is comprised of older workers with minimal to no work capacity to meet the non-medical SSDI eligibility criteria. These individuals would be eligible for SSDI as it appears under current law. This would be the only group that would receive SSDI benefits as they appear under current law. And this would bring SSDI back to its original intent as an early retirement program for older disabled workers. So the remaining group, people with low work capacity, is comprised of individuals with minimal to no work capacity who don't qualify for SSDI benefits either because they're too young or they have insufficient work history. And they would be eligible for income and in-kind benefits that are at least as generous as those available under current law. Under this new system we're proposing, most individuals would receive health insurance from the same sources as other Americans. If a beneficiary is employed and has access to employer-based health insurance, they would be required to enroll. In other cases, individuals could either enroll in Medicaid or buy insurance from a state health insurance exchange, depending on the individual's household level of income. Now, retirees with impairments are a special exception. They would retain their eventual Medicare eligibility under SSDI as under current law. Now on to the financial reforms. The financial reforms have four main goals. The first one is to ensure adequate funding. We want to achieve reform without precipitous declines in finance and support for this population. Second, we want to slow federal expenditure growth. Bonnie showed earlier that expenditures for this population are rising at an unsustainable rate, and we want to bring the spending down to sustainable levels. Third, we want to encourage DSAs to make efficient decisions. And the way we're going to do this is we actually propose a funding mechanism that forces DSAs to consider the trade-offs between income benefits and the other supports that they award. And finally, we want to make funding responsible to external factors such as the business cycle. And I'll describe this more in just a minute. Federal funding for disability supports would be channeled through the Disability Support Administrators. Now, federal funding would come from the same sources as it currently does, a mixture of payroll taxes and general revenue. Now, each DSA would receive its share of federal funding based on a formula that would take into account several factors, including projected needs, ability to pay payroll tax revenues, beneficiary migration and other demographic change, and the business cycle state. The idea with the business cycle state is this: that during times of rapid economic expansion, excess DSA funding would be saved in a rainy day fund that could be used during times of economic contraction to finance additional supports. This approach would work as long as this rainy day fund is not rated. Once the DSA's level of funding is determined, it would be administered through a two-step process. The first step would have SSA and CMS pay all income and Medicare costs in the DSA's catchment area, and then whatever funding left over would be given directly to the DSA to finance all other supports. So there are two advantages with this approach. First, we're using existing payment mechanisms at SSA and CMS, so each DSA does not have to also develop this capability. The setup also forces DSAs to consider the trade-offs between income and SSDI awards and the other supports that they award, because whatever income supports and SSDI awards they make, those funds cannot be used to finance the other supports that they award. State funding requirements would initially remain the same. So states would have to fund all the DSAs within their borders, even if the state does not administer the DSAs. States would initially divert funds currently used to pay disability benefits in the state. This would include funding for programs such as Medicaid and VR. Eventually, each state's funding requirement would be a proportion of the federal funding that its DSAs receive. But we need a bridge to reform. So I just laid out for you a vision for a 21st century disability policy in America. You've heard it, and you may even like it. But to this point, I have not talked at all about building a bridge from where we are now to this policy that we envision. In many ways, I think that disability policy in America is like this man right here on the edge of a cliff. We can't keep going forward in the same direction that we've been going. That would be disastrous. On the other side of the ravine, there is a 21st century disability policy that we want to get to. But building a bridge to get over this ravine is going to be difficult, and it's going to take time. And now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Dave Stapleton, who will talk about how to build this bridge.
Thank you. I'm very gratified to see everybody here. We were afraid with our new location that nobody'd show up, but I think we have a record crowd, and I'm just sorry for the people who are over there looking for us at our old office right now. So Dave, man, hasn't had much time to present lots of details. And at this point, you're probably wondering about what many of the details are. Hopefully with some curiosity, perhaps with a little bit of incredulity, and maybe with some dread. There is an issue brief in the folder you received, which has a little bit more detail, and I would encourage you all, though, to go look at the paper, which you can find online, which has quite a bit more detail. But even there, you're going to come away dissatisfied because many of the details are just not specified. So instead, really what we've done is present a framework for future policy with details to be proposed and developed over some period of time, debated, tested, adopted when successful, and gradually implemented over what will likely be a very long period. So I'm going to start by illustrating both the promise and the ambiguity of the proposal by taking a quick look at the current support system for workers with significant medical conditions and how it might change under future policy. This example is important because one of the most pressing disability issues we face at the moment is exhaustion of the SSDI trust fund in 2017 probably, and because many argued that the rapid growth in the SSDI beneficiaries that Bonnie showed on one slide reflects the inadequacy of the current support system for such workers. After that, I'm going to talk about how the United States could start the transition from the current policy that we have today toward a policy that's like the one that David has described. So this slide depicts the situation faced by workers who have a long-lasting medical condition that limits their ability to continue their work. The diagram shows that these workers might go through one of three doors to get help. The first two doors are marked private disability insurance and workers' compensation. Under current policy, some workers with medical problems are covered by private disability insurance, or if their condition is job-related, by workers' compensation. Such workers often get services that help them stay at work without ever losing their job in the first place. But some, however, end up leaving their jobs and go on SSDI, and the insurer is likely to help them along that path. Most workers with medical conditions, however, do not have private disability insurance, and only a minority have medical conditions that are work-related. Often the employers of such workers have little incentive to help them, and if the worker's productivity has dropped off, or the employer is bearing substantial costs for their health care, they have every incentive to terminate their employment. They go through the third door, which is the layoff door. There's another group that goes through the layoff door, and that's people with medical conditions who are laid off from their jobs for reasons unrelated to their medical condition. There's a recession. You might have heard about those recently. There's reduced demand for the company's products, perhaps because of foreign competition or many other reasons. Whatever the reason for the job loss, the laid-off worker is left to his or her own devices in the labor market. Many collect unemployment benefits for some period, but those run out. Many may struggle to address their medical issues and get a new job, perhaps obtaining some vocational rehabilitation services or other publicly provided services in the process. A very large number, though, end up applying for SSDI. And that may be after a very long struggle to try to stay in the labor force. So the SSDI application, as I'm sure most of you know, can take many, many months, often years, even when it's successful. Once people enter SSDI, then they're offered a whole bunch of return-to-work services. We call them the SSDI work incentives, help you get back to work. But they don't get assistance with health care until another 24 months when they automatically become eligible for Medicare. So it's really not very surprising that after going through this difficult period, a few people actually leave SSDI because of work. SSDI benefits and Medicare do ensure a level of economic security for many people who go down this path, but many also end up living in poverty, as Bonnie has described. So now let's envision what might be on the other side of the canyon that David showed us, skipping over how to get there. So this slide depicts what we see on the other side of the canyon. It's our vision that any worker with a problematic, long-lasting medical condition could obtain help via a disability support administrator as soon as that help is needed. This includes workers covered by private disability insurance or workers' compensation. As David has described, the DSA would be responsible for assessing the individual's work capacity and assigning the individual to one of these three groups. Those with substantial capacity would receive tailored integrated supports designed to help them stay in the labor force and become more self-sufficient again. Depending on their age, those with little potential capacity would either get SSDI and Medicare, or they would get a different package for those people with low work capacity of tailored integrated supports, really designed to provide them economic security. And I should add that we envision a level of economic security that is substantially higher than what's available to people who go on SSI today. At this point, though, you might be thinking, well, you know, these days they want to have the state VR agencies take over the disability support system for working-age people, perhaps with help from the state's DDS. Well, if you're from a VR agency, you're probably saying, that's great, you know, it's about time somebody recognized what we could do. But maybe you're a cash and counseling fan and you see that the DSA could be responsible for providing the worker with resources that the worker needs so that he or she can stay at work, plus some advice on how to use those resources. So that would be a different model. Or maybe you're a believer in the private market, and maybe you have conjectured that the DSA's function will be to create and support a short-term disability insurance market under which every worker will enroll with a private disability insurer, and the insurer will be responsible for helping the worker stay at work or return to work if feasible and obtain long-term benefits if not. Those of you familiar with the Otter-Duggan proposal, that's their model. So, in fact, you need to know that all of these models fit under our proposal. And there are many others as well that would fit under the proposal. So we have not, in fact, specified exactly what this model is going to look like. In 2006, the Social Security Advisory Board suggested development and testing of systems that look like this, but without a lot of specificity. So we haven't really gone beyond that in many ways. Other serious proposals have emerged, some from disability advocacy organizations and others from economists. We do not pretend to know what the best model is, or even if there is a best model. Does anybody? I don't think so. So at this point then, you may be thinking, this is a great vision, but you may also be thinking about an old punchline from an old Northern New England joke, which is where I happen to come from. You can't get there from here. It's impossible. Most people believe that only incremental improvements are possible in U.S. policy. But as Bonnie has talked about, incremental changes haven't worked. The many incremental changes made in the last 3 decades have not reversed the trends in the economic status of people with disabilities or growth in government expenditures for their support. Instead, they add complexity and inefficiency to a system that is already sinking under the weight of its complexity. They don't address the structural problems that are causing the support system to fail. There are many obstacles to structural change, and I'm sure you're familiar with most of them. The first of these, we think, is the inadequate evidence base. There's a high level of distrust about any proposal because we do not know enough about the consequences of actually implementing a structural change along those lines. That means that there is little consensus among advocates, little consensus among policymakers about how to move forward. And if we move forward based on what we know now, we'd be putting many people with disabilities at risk. And we'd also be putting taxpayers at risk. Expenditure growth might accelerate rather than decelerate, which is one of the objectives. Fiscal austerity is also an impediment to structural change. How can we possibly afford to design and test something new given the state of the fiscal situation of the federal government? Finally, and I think maybe most importantly, program fragmentation, which Bonnie has talked about, I think really stands in the way of even modest structural change. For one reason, there is a lot of vested interest in the current structure. Structural change implies changing the structure, so people who have those interests, potentially, they don't know what's going to happen to them, and that's understandable. But the second is that program administrators under the current system are able to innovate within their own programs, but incentives discourage them to work with other programs to do broader, more structural innovations where we think the gains from efficiency can really be found, as well as the better economic outcomes for people with disabilities. So given these obstacles, how can we possibly cross the canyon to a better disability support system in the future? As David says, we need to build a bridge. So this slide shows a picture of a bridge being built across the canyon. How do we build a bridge that will support a safe move from the current policy to a better future policy? Another way you could think of it is, how can we accommodate positive policy change? It is an accommodation. It's going to allow people with disabilities, the person shown earlier in the picture, to access the other side of the canyon. Well, we think the first step is to start a demonstration period, which is intended to build the evidence base and build a sufficient consensus around a new structure to enact policy reforms. Such a demonstration period is going to take a long time, at least 10 years, probably longer. The demonstrations that would be conducted during this period that we envision would require a lot of collaboration between federal agencies, as well as state agencies, large municipalities, counties, various private organizations. So a lot of cooperation is going to be required. In order to proceed with demonstrations of this sort, legislation is going to be required. That legislation, among other things, would define the scope and the objectives and the timetable for the demonstration period, establish a National Disability Commission to oversee the demonstration period, require cooperation from federal agencies, and also build in reasonable safeguards to protect people with disabilities and others who are involved in the demonstration. And finally, and I didn't put this one on the slide, it's going to have provisions for financial support of the demonstration process. if the demonstration period eventually leads to a consensus on how to restructure the support system, only then would we start to design a gradual shift from current policy to the restructured policy. It is extremely important to recognize that we can't just flip a switch, and on December 31st, 2024, all of a sudden we change from the old policy to the new policy on January 1st, 2025. That's just not going to happen. Most importantly, we would need to protect people with disabilities who become dependent on current programs. We expect that many would be grandfathered in, but with an option to switch to the new programs if they found them more attractive. So if you add the gradual period of shifting to new programs onto the demonstration period, you can easily see that it's going to take 2-3 decades, even longer, to get to a new, fully restructured policy. So now the prospects for restructuring may seem even more bleak than ever. But I think it's important to think about what the alternative is. Many people think that the alternative is the status quo, but I think it's not the status quo because fiscal pressures are precluding the continuation of current programs at the level of funding growth that we've experienced over the last few decades. They're all almost certainly going to be trimmed in terms of eligibility or benefits going forward. And in fact, if you've paid attention to state Medicaid programs and what the states are doing to save on Medicaid spending, you can see that that's already happening with Medicaid. There are many proposals in Congress to cut back on Medicare growth expenditures in various ways, as well as even proposals to reduce eligibility for SSDI benefits. Now, there also may be options for small efficiency gains within programs, and I'm sure that those will also be pursued, but they are only the ones that can operate within the programs themselves and really can't pursue ones that require broad structural change across multiple programs. So I'm quite confident that such efforts are going to reduce growth in government expenditures for the support of people with disabilities because they're going to have to. They're going to be forced to because of our fiscal situation. But I also am quite confident that they'll further undermine the economic security of many people with disabilities in the process, not enhance it. In other words, they won't turn around the trends in employment and income that Bonnie showed you early on. So it seems to me that society has a choice. We can go along with decades of trimming eligibility and benefits, seeking efficiency gains within programs, but deteriorating economic security of people with disabilities. The second option is to jumpstart a structural reform process, to start a demonstration period with objectives and a timetable. And it also seems to me that proceeding with that process could have the benefit of buying some short-term protection for the current programs. If we've got something we're looking forward to and trying to do better in the future, perhaps we can protect the level of benefits offered by the current programs a little bit longer. So I want to conclude with comments about how we came to write this paper, partly by a way of introducing the next speaker, Kelly Buckland. A few months ago, Kelly and I were talking about, with some others, about existing ideas for reforms that would reduce entry into SSDI. Dave Wittenberg mentioned some of those in his introductory remarks. And Kelly was saying he really didn't like any of the proposals under consideration because they weren't far-reaching enough. And he expressed that his preferences were to go into a system where benefits weren't conditioned on ability to work. They were rather just there so that people with disabilities could do what every other people like to do. And my reaction was, that's a great idea. And in fact, I've thought about this idea before, but it's just too costly for taxpayers. We never get that passed. So that created a challenge. Is there something we could do that's short of what Kelly would like, but that gets us much further towards that than we've ever been before? Can we describe a policy structure that would be much closer to what Kelly would want? And but that would be palatable to taxpayers? And can we find a way to get there from here? So David and I are presenting this proposal with the expectation that people will find fault with it. Faults will be found. And that's okay. We want to get people talking about this. We don't have all the answers, and we're not trying to convince you that we do. Our ultimate purpose is to change the nature of discussion about disability policy reform. get past talking about incremental changes that seem doomed to fail. Let's begin talking about an informed and gradual transition to a restructured system that works better for both people with disabilities and taxpayers. If such a system turns out to be a lot different than the one that we envision, and policymakers take a different path than the one that we've sketched, well, that's fine with us as long as it leads to improved economic outcomes for people with disabilities, even as lawmakers try to slow the growth in expenditures for their support. So, Kelly, I'd like to know what you think.
Okay, well, thanks, David. So I am a little different up here. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a PhD, and my name's not David. I'm simply an advocate, and first of all, I just want to say it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here today, comment about this proposal to reform the current system of employment-related services for people with disabilities in America. As David said, I'm frustrated with efforts to just kind of tinker with the system and then sit around and believe that that's really going to result in any substantial kinds of improvements to the employment rates of people with disabilities. I think a majority of people, especially people with disabilities, believe that it will take substantial reform to improve the employment rate of people with disabilities. I do have to clarify that my comments today represent my perspective, and they don't necessarily represent positions of the National Council on Independent Living or Nickel, who's my employer, all right? So, but some of this stuff has actually come out of some stuff that Nickel's produced. We all know from numerous studies that most people with disabilities are capable of and want to work. However, our current system that was designed decades ago is currently outdated and contains numerous disincentives that discourage people from going to work and losing the benefits that took them years to get. So, as this proposal points out, SSI benefits are based on income standards that have no relation to extra costs associated with people's impairments. And Medicare pays for equipment that's sufficient for use by those who stay at home, but not for those who work. And in order to get on benefits, you have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can work. In fact, you have to swear that you can't work, that you might die from your impairment, and you have to have doctors then certify that you are correct. You're not just making this stuff up. I really agree with Bonnie that a reform system should, one, take advantage of advances in medicine, technology, training, and workplace accommodations. Two, it should reinforce the societal expectation that people with disabilities can work and should work. It should motivate and empower people with disabilities to pursue employment, and finally reduce duplication. Increase program efficiency, and improve return on taxpayer investments. I really have to congratulate Mathematica on the fact that they are suggesting taking some really bold steps to substantially reform the current system as it relates to employment of people with disabilities. However, I think it's important to note how important these supports are for people with disabilities, and David kind of did that, and what a critical role that they play in supporting people with disabilities. Therefore, it's really important to build any reformed system so that it doesn't jeopardize those supports for people with disabilities. And that's why I like the fact that this proposal uses pilot programs or demonstration models to build upon and improve the current system by encouraging innovation and then identifying best practices. We should have high expectations of people with disabilities. As this proposal states, we should expect and empower people to work despite their significant impairments. However, we also need to ensure that those expected to work would benefit from working, not be punished. More specifically, reform should increase the economic status and independence of individuals with disabilities and increase their earnings much more than it would take away. However, I don't think simply turning over the powers of eligibility determination and providing services to people with disabilities from the federal government over to the states is going to accomplish that end. In fact, people with disabilities have all too much recent history about states slashing their budgets and slashing the services that support people with disabilities because they have constitutional requirements to balance their budgets. We also have experience with states taking federal money and using those monies on purposes that's well outside the purpose that those monies were sent to the states to spend it on. That's very recent. We saw that happen with stimulus money. We saw that happen with Medicaid maintenance of effort money. You can go down the list. States have done that over and over, and as long as they are not prosecuted or whatever, they're going to continue to do it if they have to do that to balance their budgets. So that causes me concern. I also have concerns around categorizing people and putting them into different silos. That's partly what's gotten us where we are. So this putting people into workers with disabilities, retirees with impairments, and then people with low work capacity is simply another way of categorizing people and putting them into slots. What I really think we should be doing is taking people as individuals. We should be assessing what their strengths are as an individual, and then building on their capacities and their individual strengths to make them or help them achieve a career. The proposal suggests that people with disabilities should get their health benefits from employers, and maybe I'm just not grasping the whole concept here, but as we know that, or get their health insurance benefits from the health insurance exchanges that are set up under the Affordable Care Act. But if those are based upon the current, we call benchmark services, or what employers typically provide in a health insurance, Medicaid does a lot more than that. A good example is personal assistance services. So how is that going to be provided in a meaningful and safe way for people to continue to get what they need in order to go to work? You need somebody to come in and get you up and get you off to work before you go to work. Even though the DSA thing, to me, has always stood for Designated State Agency, as I've done a lot of work on the Rehab Act, I do like the proposal. I do like the fact that those DSAs are not a designated state agency. They could be a number of entities. As David said, they could be the VR agency, or being an independent living advocate. I don't know why it couldn't be an independent living center, or a state independent living council, or some other entity. But what does kind of escape me in this whole thing, and then again, being an independent living advocate, where is the consumer control, and where is the peer support? We believe that those are really kind of the key to making any program successful. People with disabilities should be in charge of the services that support them. And we built all of our services off of a peer support model, believing that people with disabilities really are the expert about providing services to people with disabilities. So that's kind of escaping me. But maybe what you were saying, David, in your presentation was shedding a little bit of light into that, in that there really is no model that's proposed in this, and you could set up models that are based upon consumer control and peer support. So maybe it is in there, and it's just not highlighted. So I guess to sum things up, I really do like the fact that this proposal is taking a bold approach of really reforming the system. But as David stated, it's a little scary to me because there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of stuff that's not specified. And these are services that are really critical to people and living their day-to-day lives. And in fact, some of these services are so critical that without them, people would die. So with that, that's kind of my reaction to stuff. So, and I just wanted to end by saying these guys have no idea what I was going to say. They still let me come up here and twist me. So with that, thanks very much, everybody.
We told him we know where he lives, so.
I think we started with the title of a discouraging picture and we ended, without these services, people will die. So I get to moderate a discussion of everything that happened in between there, in case you fell asleep. And I think Kelly raised a number of interesting questions, and I certainly want to let the panel discuss those questions, but I also want to have audience participation, I think, initially. And just a management issue, we started about 10 minutes late. It's currently 1:10. We were thinking of running to about 1:40. So we'll take questions for approximately 30 minutes. I'm going to start with the audience here, and one of the big changes we have is that there's no microphone. So I actually am going to point to you. I'm intentionally not going to call on you by name, lest I forget somebody's name. That'll be exposed. But when you ask your question, what I'd like for you to do is state your name, affiliation, and your question. I'll briefly restate the question, and our panel members will answer. So why don't we open it up? I'm going to take questions from the front of the room initially, and Jennifer, if you could help me with people in the back of the room for pointing. So, yes. Yes.
Okay. Joanne Schneider, George Washington University. I am both a researcher on disability and other policy and a person with several hidden disabilities. And I wanted to congratulate you. I think the general idea is a really good one. And Kelly, I also shared your concern. But there were several things I saw missing, and I wanted to ask you to think about and address those. The first is, this looks like a model designed for the adult onset disability population and the SSDI population. And as we all know, those statistics on unemployment at the beginning are everybody, not just them. And so I'm wondering where the intellectual and developmental disabilities populations fit into this, the whole population, like folks like me who need accommodations but sure wouldn't qualify for SSDI ever, fit into this, that whole thing. That's the first question. The second one, which I think most folks miss, is the whole issue of business and the very complex set of issues with employers and coworkers and all of that. And I'm wondering how you would address that and where you see working on that side of it in developing a model like this. The third is, I see a lot of co-opting and bringing in current system. Having experienced voc rehab from the inside and having done a lot of research on the employment pieces of it, they're slow. They're really, really desperately underfunded, and sometimes the mindset is not quite where you need it to be. There's some really wonderful stuff out there, but not always, and I know people here know the research on this. So how do you see shoring up those very key employment systems, both in terms of funding and what they're doing, so that something like this could actually work?
Thanks, Joanne. And just to repeat for the folks on the phone, Joanne, the first part of her question was how do we treat people with intellectual and mental disabilities as those with that would categorize as less severe?
And all the rest that don't qualify for SSDI.
The second is how do we work with businesses and having sort of natural work supports, and how do those supports fit within the current systems. And the third is actually the systemic side of, how does your new plan deal with the key employment supports that are already being provided, albeit in a disjointed system of supports. So,
Either way, which one do you want to tackle?
I think-
Why don't you start?
Dave, why don't you answer?
So, I think, let me just say a few things, and Dave can add, I guess. I think we see this system as helping a broader population than those who are currently on SSI or SSDI. One of the keys, and we point this out in the paper, and I think the issue brief as well, is in order to make that financially viable, we'd have to have enough people who now would be on SSI or SSDI providing more support for themselves so that we can afford to pay for people who would not be on SSI or SSDI now. So we do see that orientation expand the number of people who are getting some type of support. And the expansion would be in that group that we've called workers with disabilities. The business issues, I think, is a very tough one. I think one role we see for the disability support administrator, whatever that entity is they're in their interest to have people be employed. So why not have, they would have an interest in working with local business community, doing job carving and things of that nature, which should help, we think, improve employment. But there is a tough nut to crack, so we don't think we've cracked it. And finally, what you say about the VR system, I think the problem that we see, we think that the change in the financing approach addresses the financing that you need, because now the disability support administrator controls, in some fashion, all the financing for that area, whether it's for income benefits or medical support or whatever, so including employment services. So and that's going to become a priority, right? Whereas now it's almost an afterthought. So that's not a complete answer. Dave's going to give you the complete answer.
Just one point, a couple points on working with businesses. One of the nice aspects of the proposal is that an individual who has a disability onset doesn't have to stop working in order to apply for benefits. So when they have a disability onset, they can go to the DSA administrator while they're still employed and say, this is what I need to stay employed. They can talk to the employer and try and see if that person can give them the assistance they need to stay at work and never leave work. We also in our the paper that we wrote proposed using funding mechanisms also to encourage employers to retain people with disabilities. So basically experience rating, payroll taxes, so that employers that send a lot of people to the disability administrators or lay off large amounts of individuals with disabilities would have to pay higher taxes, and then vice versa, that people who retain those people would actually be given financial incentives to do so.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I beat you, John. Get the next one.
All right. Hi, David Fields from Mitch. I had a question. For these DSAs, who would be doing the evaluations? You said people are going to have to be reevaluated on numerous occasions to see if they qualify. Who and what type of experience are these folks going to have to evaluate someone to determine whether they should be or shouldn't be eligible?
That's a minor detail that needs to be developed. More than that. I think the way I think of it, currently states do the initial determination for SSA, and so they have that capacity, but they don't have any responsibility for the results financially, right? And we think that you can potentially give the same organization that has the financial responsibility for the results the capacity for disability determination. I think you can build on what the state DBS can do, but you obviously have to do a lot more. And I think one of the biggest challenges to putting in a system like this is building a disability evaluation system. We think there are going to be national standards for this, but that each agency would be doing its own, each administrator would be doing its own. We also think it's really critical to have some type of an appeals process, and we see that as a role for the federal government with a consumer board that has oversight authority. And so it's complicated, and I think that is an area that a lot of time will need to be spent on. Now, we do know there are other eligibility determination processes besides the DES process. The VRA is first is an example, and in other countries, some countries are ahead of us in terms of figuring out, well, can this person actually work, and what do we need to do to get them to work? And so those processes are things that we can learn from, but there's a lot of work to do in that area.
Can I comment on this? Can I weigh in on this one, Ruth? I think this is really a critical question because we're so used to determining people's eligibility based on ability they can't work.
Now we got to do it.
So the people who are doing the determinations now couldn't do it. Right? Because they're so, in my opinion, they're so ingrained in looking at it that way. For them to shift gears would be, because this really has, in my opinion, in order for it to work, this really has to turn that on its head. You have to stop looking at people in regards to benefits based upon what it is you can't do. So,
Sam, and then we'll take one from our online audience following.
Sue Ellen Galbraith from Anchor. Thank you, Kelly. You got at the heart of it, because I don't think the first question was really addressed, that this model looks like it's based on more on a model around early on adult onset and where are people with intellectual disabilities. I think the issue that, or the point that you raised, Kelly, about continuing silos instead of focusing on the individual. What is it that person needs to become employed or in other ways to be supported, I think is is what we should be looking at. I do applaud you for saying we've got to have major reforms and to, start us in the discussion. I think that's critical. I'd like to say, in terms of another bridge, a whole new Congress, because they are coming after us. Coming after programs, Medicaid, cut off the microphones, the tape recorders, coming after Social Security, SSI, and DI, and we already know some of that. So I think, though, some of Bonnie's points ought to be strengthened, though. When you look at the explosion in numbers and enrollment, also carefully look at what that means, that women were not in the workforce before, that in an economic downturn, you may go on disability because you're not near a retirement age. So, number two. And number three, I share all the concerns Kelly's expressed, and I would say I am concerned about a Congress and states that are looking for quick fixes with savings shown faster than a 10-year demo. That's not to say demos or pilots, but I think we also have to look at this realistically in terms of what somebody might bite off of in terms of legislation.
So who would like to take Sue's question, and I'm going to try to summarize it real quickly, which is, how do you deal with providing supports early enough after the disability onset, and how do you provide evidence basis in a quick enough fashion to be convincing to the Congress so something rash does not happen? Let me...
Can I just get the one point?
That's not the question, and it's 3 times it's been right.
Okay, well, the one I heard this was one of your concerns, and Kelly voiced it earlier, was the idea of siloing and not evaluating people individually. I think that what the policy we're proposing actually does evaluate people individually. Well, people come to the DSA and are assessed on an individual basis for their potential work capacity, and then the supports that they receive are tailored to them based on that evaluation. So, I think the evaluations are done at an individual level. I hear that the danger about these silos, but you could remove these technical silos, and the system still remains, that people are going to the DSAs as individuals, being evaluated as individuals, and receiving tailored benefits as individuals.
So I heard lots of questions, and I don't think I could address them all, although I'd love to if we had time. But let me talk about the quick fixes one, because I think that's a great concern. And this really relates to the final comments that I had, is that I think that we're in a situation now where, because of the fiscal situation, that we are going to see gradual cutbacks in the programs that people with disabilities rely on. And we're probably past the point where we can stop that completely. And I also think it's really important, as you do clearly, that we not look for some policy fix, some big structural change that we can just turn on overnight and go to it, because that'll be a disaster. And we've AVAC has been doing the Ticket to Work evaluation. You may know that Ticket to Work was rolled out without any pilot demonstration or anything, and it took SSA a long time. It was a pretty simple program, but it's layered over all these complex programs. It took them a long time to get it rolled out. It has not been the wonderful success that people hoped it would be, and it wasn't tested. And we could be just going down that road again, only far worse, if Congress decides to make some big structural change in the programs that serve this really vulnerable population. So I think that one of the things we're trying to offer and get the idea across is, let's start a process that will lead to structural change, that will lead to better programs down the road and lower fiscal responsibility for the programs as a way to help us protect the current programs while we get to that point. And maybe that's not a trade-off that Congress is willing to listen to, but that's a central idea of what we're suggesting.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the web.
First question is from Roxanne Lamar, and she says that she's run into people who can only be described as comfortable with their situation, working less than they're capable and balanced with benefits and more free time. So can you say more about how the proposed reforms can avoid nurturing this situation?
I guess there are two situations. There are those who are currently in the system, and then there are those who would come into the restructured system just without receiving this support before. I think that the latter, those individuals, their work capacity would be evaluated, and if determined to have sufficient work capacity, they would be expected to work. Now, they would be given all the assistance that they need to realize that work capacity, but I think that expectation would be there. For individuals who are already in the system, I think it's a more difficult question. We talked about grandfathering those people in from the old system to the new system. So I don't know. I don't think we really specified that detail of how to change those expectations.
I think a critical point here is that the goal of the Disability Service Administrator is to help people work and earn as much as they possibly can. And we don't know exactly how they're going to do that, but that's what their performance is going to be based on. And so I think that's a really critical difference from our current programs.
Lisa Ekman with Health and Disability Advocates. A couple of things. First, I don't want to mischaracterize the proposal, but it sounds dangerously close to a block grant to me. That you give the DSA money to provide all the services, and then it's based on a federal formula, which isn't fleshed out fully in the paper, I think. So there may be some incentives to move people into categories which will move them out of support. And that is very dangerous to me, especially in states that are already looking at savings. So if, for example, you say that there could be conditions or requirements for people in the workers with disabilities category, maybe I would have an incentive to say you can work 30 hours, and if you don't, you lose your services. So I think that's one thing I would suggest maybe we need to think about and talk about more. The second thing is that I think it's vitally important that there is an appeals process. Although it seems like we're moving away from some current entitlements as they're looked at in federal law. But we already know that when the federal government processes appeals, it delays things. And that's why it takes 2 years for some people to get benefits. If you add the complexity of the fact that what this determination does not only determines what services you get, but the potential you could be kicked off of benefits, seems like you would, if you don't meet the conditions or requirements, that you'll have multiple layers of appeal. Can I appeal how many hours you said I could work? Can I appeal which category I'm in? Can I appeal that I'm not in any category? And I'm afraid that what we would end up with is 5 years before someone gets where they want to be. And I think that's something to think through too. While someone's in the process of an appeal, do they get benefits? Do those requirements and conditions kick in while they're appealing before the ultimate decision? I think it's a lot of pieces that are moving, and that gets at one of the biggest problems with the current system, is that it's hard for us to classify people where they belong, whether they all or nothing belong somewhere. Now you're adding very fine determinations that people need to make. What's the difference between someone who can work 20 hours and 24? So I just would pose those both to you.
So what are these proposals essentially moving towards a block grant program, or are they a block grant program as proposed, is I think the first question. And the second question by Lisa deals with the appeal process. We currently have a very lengthy process for people to get on disability programs. Is this process potentially going to make it longer? Is there a risk of creating an initial administrative structure and creating additional unintentional costs?
I'm going to choose one and I'll do the other.
Okay.
Oh no, they're both tough. I guess I'll do the first one, the block grant idea. The idea of block granting was something that we talked about a lot, and I thought about, and actually we talked to this with Kelly in discussions, which he thought was block granting to the states was a bad idea. So we kind of came to that conclusion ourselves as well. And I think there are several elements of the proposal let me back up for a second. The funding is not open-ended, clearly, as it is under the current system. There is a finite limit of federal funding and then state funding given to the DSAs. But the DSAs are not administered by the state, so this finite funding is given to the entity that's best able to administer the DSA. And then we would hope that the safeguards that are in place, from the advocacy board to the minimum standards set by the federal government and other safeguards, would help protect beneficiaries and applicants. So scenarios like the one that you suggested could happen would not.
Just to clarify, I think that was my point about entitlement. Entitlements are kind of open-ended, and that's funding, and that's why they continue to grow. So if you're entitled to Medicaid, for example, you get Medicaid, and the state has to provide it to you, and the federal government pays its share regardless of whether you've already spent whatever that level is. So that's the concern. You said that it isn't open-ended, but for entitlement, it kind of is. Once you're entitled, you get what you're entitled to. And that's the concern.
So, concerning the eligibility determination, we realize that these incentives that you talked about are there, and that the DSA will have incentives to push you into less expensive set of benefits. We did describe an appeals process. We didn't flesh it out, and we think that is something that needs to be in place and has to be strong. We have suggested that some kind of a system of consumer oversight boards, and it would be like a national board and then a board corresponding to each TSA that would kind of be a watchdog. But I think, that's a very difficult question. And I think we don't have all the answers to that, but I always contrast it to the way the system is now. We have an appeals process now that far too many cases get appealed, and I think part of that is because it's an either-or decision. You get benefits, or you get nothing. Right? I mean, this system, there are different categories, and even within categories, there's more gradation of what you get. So the value of each decision is not nearly so large. But we agree that part of the problem moving forward, and part of the reason that everybody's nervous about states, is how do you have an effective oversight system that gets the DSAs to do what they're supposed to be doing, which is helping this population do well, improving their economic security. And,
Just a couple more minutes, we'll go to this gentleman in the back, and we'll try to take one more on the web.
I'll try to come back to you guys.
Hi, I'm Dan Bronan with the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disabilities Services. And I have a question, actually, the exact nature of my question, I'm not sure how to ask it, so I know at what age you envision people would be able to enter this system. So would children be part of this program, or would it be when people turn 18?
And Dan's question for those on the web is at what age do people enter the system, and are children eligible specifically like they are in the Child SSI program?
So as we've described it, it is intended to be an adult system, but we certainly envision children aging into the system as teenagers. There really isn't any reason you couldn't. You could potentially expand the system in a way that it's interfaced with the school, and in fact, the DSA would have incentives to do that because it wants children with disabilities to become adults with disabilities even more, right? So we do see that as something that the DSAs will concern themselves with. I think there are lots of issues about how that happens. We haven't.
Sure. So I guess the way that I would ask my question then, and you addressed it a little bit, is one of the big challenges that we face now is the expectations that are set for people who have lifelong disabilities during their, when they're minors, when they're not into a system that provides employment supports. So there's not only expectations, but what kinds of services are provided that prepare people for work. Even up through high school, are 16-year-olds with a developmental disability being told that they can expect to enter the workforce? Are they being given job preparation, mentorships, all the things that children without disabilities get? And so I would, especially when you're talking about an assessment, and now you're talking about maybe when they're 18, they come into this program, and now there's an assessment of a person's capacity for work, I think that you have missed the opportunity to ensure that people have a high capacity for work, because it's all, their expectations and their preparation has already been set in a lot of ways. So how would you address that?
Like I said, I think the DSA would have an incentive to address that and to work with the school system so that when kids come out, they are ready to work. I also think just the fact that you've changed the adult system ought to make the schools and parents aware that when the kid grows up, there is this expectation that they can work, but also a system in place to support that. So you have to hope that that's going to affect people's behavior toward these children. But I think you need to do more than that. But we obviously have not address that carefully.
Okay, I'm going to go to Tony.
This question was addressed to some extent in the presentation where you talk about work opportunity tax credits or the other kinds of tax credits. But it seems to me that unless there's something deeper in the presentation, I see tax expenditures, as they're favorably known now, tax credits for particularly the expense of individuals going to work who don't qualify for cash outlays or in-kind benefits, would be an important part of this new proposal. I'd like to hear what you think about that.
So Tony's question for those on the web is how would tax outlays and tax benefits be dealt with under this new system?
We do talk about allowances and providing people allowances for extraordinary expenses. And if somebody going to work, the fact that you're going to work creates more extraordinary expenses, and those could be potentially covered by allowances. I don't know that we talked about tax credits for that specific idea, and, you know, my druthers would be to cover it through the types of allowances I described rather than through the tax system. But, you know, politically it might be easier to do it through the tax system, just because of the complexity issue. Right. And we also did talk about an earned income tax credit, right? Yeah, and expanding the tax credit. And so I think that would help for people who go back to work, but their earnings are not really high. So.
Right. So we have 2 more minutes, and Jennifer, we actually checked the web, I think. Are we?
Anybody in the back? Yes, sir. Hold on, I have a question.
Curtis Richards, Institute for Educational Leadership. I have not had a chance to read the paper, so maybe the answer's in that paper, but I'm curious as you talk about demos and 10-year demos and evidence-based research, have you done the analysis of the levels of research that have been done and so we know what the gaps are as it relates to evidence-based research in building this model? You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because evidence-based research is fairly new to the disability world.
So we in the paper, we do refer to quite a bit of the evidence that we are aware of, and, you know, I'm sure we're not aware of it all, but there are lots of gaps, and we really don't have the time to catalog them, I think, here, but we are researchers, and we've been, some of us at least, not David, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and I think what's been frustrating to me, and partly why we wrote this paper, is that we've been going on for 20 years, and things just seem to be getting worse and worse, and we don't come up with new policies that do better. And part of that is because we're not generating the evidence. I mean, there are new ideas about how to do it, but we're not generating the evidence around those ideas because of the issues that I raised, the fragmentation of the program.
But like Kelly's 2 issues, right, that are absolutely critical in this conversation about consumer control, right, and peer-to-peer, do we even have an evidence-based base, or do we just have a quasi-experimental base, or how do we get to that level before we start these demos?
Right. So we actually have some evidence on that particular issue from the cash and counseling demonstration, which we did the evaluation at Mathematica before I was here, that worked very well. And there's a lot of consumer control in cash and counseling, and I'm not don't have time to get into what all that's about, but if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to look at it. But I think you're asking some very good questions, and we have not answered them all.
I'm going to give Angel the last question.
Okay. Okay, my name is Angel. I go to the University of Maryland. So it's more like a comment. So David asked me getting, David Wittenberg, right? He asked what would it take to implement policy. So we all kind of agreed that, like, the system doesn't work. And then somebody put a slide up that looks like circle of the people in the middle, which is basically the system that we have, which is really bad. So then my idea, my thoughts are that the barriers to change, there's like a lot, but one of them, the main ones are like disciplinary and ideological barriers. Like this system is made up of a lot of people with various power structures and different interests. And so I guess one way to change, to lead to some type of change that would be beneficial is to address those disciplinary barriers. For example, special education, VR, like they all have ideologies that kind of teach disabled people from the time they're young to teach them a type of helplessness, right? And then they penalize adults for behaving that way. And so, I mean, there needs to be a whole revamping of that ideology and that system. And then we need to ask who's in power of the system, who's benefiting from it, and whose interest is it to change? Because disabled people aren't benefiting from the system, right? I mean, we basically said that disabled people are not benefiting from the system. So who's profiting from it? Taxpayers aren't benefiting from the system. Somebody's profiting. It's America, it's capitalism. Somebody's making money. So who are those people? Talk to them, and then make some type of interest convergence where disabled people and them can meet, so that some type of social change can happen. Like I read this book by a critical.
I'm sorry, we have to.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a student, but I'll go after that. But anyway, that's my thought, so.
Your thought, okay. Do you have a specific question on?
Oh, well, that was my long answer.
All right.
Okay, that's fine, yeah, I mean, you know, we think that's a critical point, and, you know, the, part of the piece of this demonstration period is to force the different interests to cooperate, through a demonstration process to show what can be done. Different approach than you've described. You better wrap it up.
Okay, yes, we're over time, and actually, we appreciate everybody for coming to the session, and we ask that you fill out the comment cards that are on your seat and give them to Jennifer or Allison, or put them in the box. So, thank you very much for your time.